In the frigid and merciless December of 1940, Western civilization's survival balanced on a thread growing thinner with each tick of the clock. Britain had triumphed in the aerial Battle of Britain. But the Blitz was devastating the cities. London blazed under bombardment. The Luftwaffe hammered industrial centers like Coventry and Liverpool relentlessly. On world maps, the British Empire appeared enormous, pink territory sprawling across 1/4 of the planet. But within Whitehall's war rooms, government leaders harbored a horrifying truth they couldn't reveal publicly. The empire wasn't merely losing soldiers. It was hemorrhaging financially unto death. Winston Churchill, whose oratory was inspiring the free world, positioned himself at his underground Cabinet War Room's desk to compose one of history's most critical letters. It bore Franklin Delano Roosevelt's name, the American president. Churchill wielded English masterfully, capable of weaponizing mere phrases. But this correspondence required a sensitive and mortifying performance. He needed to inform the globe's wealthiest neutral power that Great Britain, the 19th century's banker, the world's workshop, Napoleon's conqueror, was entirely and completely bankrupt. The correspondence was extensive and comprehensive. It outlined strategic circumstances, the U-boat danger in Atlantic waters, and the critical need for destroyers plus aircraft. But the crucial point came in the conclusion. Churchill stated that Britain's treasury would soon be incapable of cash payments for necessary survival supplies. He declared that Britons would resist on beaches and landing fields, but couldn't fight without munitions they could no longer purchase. It represented a survival appeal. It constituted an insolvency confession. To comprehend how history's wealthiest empire reached such destitution, we must examine Total War's merciless economics. When hostilities commenced in September 1939, Britain remained a financial colossus. It possessed billions in gold reserves. It controlled enormous overseas investment portfolios. British nationals owned Argentine railways, Chilean copper operations, and substantial United States industrial enterprises. London City served as global insurance and shipping headquarters. But Hitler's war differed from all previous conflicts. It was mechanized warfare. It devoured steel, petroleum, aluminum, and rubber at rates exceeding all pre-war projections. And critically, Britain imported nearly everything. The European continent's blockade meant Britain couldn't trade with neighbors. It had to seek survival supplies across the Atlantic from the United States. At this juncture, America maintained official neutrality. The American populace was isolationist. They recalled the First World War when American youth perished in European trenches and were determined to avoid another foreign bloodbath. Congress had enacted neutrality acts designed to keep America uninvolved. These acts included a specific provision called cash and carry. The cash and carry statute dictated that warring nations like Britain could purchase American supplies, but must pay cash immediately and transport them on their own vessels. There would be no loans, no credit extended. The Americans were willing to sell war materials, but demanded gold up front before crates departed New York docks. For the initial war year, Britain depleted its treasury meeting these requirements. They liquidated gold reserves. In a clandestine operation called Operation Fish, the British government loaded the nation's entire gold wealth onto battleships and fast liners and transported it across the perilous Atlantic to Canadian vaults. It was history's largest physical wealth movement. Billions in gold bars and negotiable securities were exiled to pay American creditors. By late 1940, the gold had vanished. The liquid cash was exhausted. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington, responsible for acquiring planes and tanks, had unsigned contracts on their desks because London Treasury officials reported no remaining dollars to honor them. When Roosevelt received Churchill's letter, he grasped the implications. He understood that Britain's fall meant America would be next. But he confronted a political obstacle. He couldn't simply grant money to Britain. American laws prohibited it, and the American public would be furious. He needed a method to assist Britain that resembled a shrewd business transaction, not charitable giving. He needed to sell the war effort to American taxpayers. This is where Lend-Lease was conceived. Roosevelt explained it to journalists with a folksy comparison. He said that when your neighbor's house catches fire, you don't negotiate over a garden hose's price. You lend him the hose and he returns it when the fire's extinguished. It sounded straightforward. It sounded magnanimous. It sounded like neighborly assistance. But the reality of closed-door Washington negotiations was completely different. It wasn't a conversation between neighbors. It was a foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. The American Treasury's leader was Henry Morgenthau Jr. He was a committed anti-fascist and wanted Britain to defeat Hitler. But he also guarded the American taxpayer. He believed that before the United States provided a single dollar of aid, Britain must demonstrate it had stripped itself of every remaining asset. He wanted to ensure the British weren't concealing any money. Morgenthau demanded a complete British Empire audit. He demanded to see every asset list owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere globally. He wanted to know every shell casing's value, every woolen sock, and every stock share. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were astonished. They were being asked to open their accounts to a foreign power. They were being treated not as an ally fighting a common enemy, but as a failed company in receivership. Phillips attempted to argue. He explained that Britain had already liquidated its gold. He explained that selling long-term investments mid-war would be a fire sale, that they would receive pennies on the dollar. He argued that stripping Britain of overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war, unable to feed its population or rebuild its cities. Morgenthau was unmoved. His presidential instructions were clear. The United States would not provide aid until Britain had scraped the barrel's bottom. The logic was brutal. If Britain still possessed United States assets, why should the American taxpayer subsidize the war? Why should an Iowa farmer pay for a British Army tank if a British lord still owned a New Jersey factory? The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was the American Viscose Corporation case. American Viscose was a massive industrial giant. It was the United States' largest rayon and artificial silk manufacturer. It was owned by a British company, Courtaulds. It was a jewel in British overseas investments' crown. It was highly profitable, generating millions annually in dividends flowing back to London, helping balance Britain's trade deficit. Morgenthau identified American Viscose as a target. He told British negotiators they had to sell it. He wanted the sale cash deposited in the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing weapon orders. The British resisted. They knew the company was worth over $100 million. To sell it hurriedly during a war would be financial suicide, but Morgenthau held the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was advancing through Congress. The isolationists were attacking it, arguing that Britain was actually rich and was trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb. He needed to show Congress that Britain was bleeding. He gave the British an ultimatum: sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease will die in committee. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, under immense Washington pressure, the British government seized the American Viscose Corporation from its owner, Courtaulds. They did not request permission. It was a compulsory purchase order issued under emergency war powers. The sale was handled by a group of American investment bankers. because the sale was distressed, because everyone knew the British had to sell. The bankers drove a ruthless bargain. The company was sold for roughly $54 million. It was a robbery. The company was worth at least twice that amount. The British government had to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds back in London, adding to their own internal debt, while the dollars from the sale went straight into the U.S. Treasury to pay for rifles and aircraft engines. The sale of American Viscose was a turning point. It was the moment the British elite realized the true price of the special relationship. They were not partners. They were a junior entity being stripped of their assets to pay for their survival. The United States was absorbing the British Empire's wealth, not by conquest, but by contract. But it wasn't just industrial assets. The liquidation extended to the empire itself's geopolitical foundations. While financial negotiators were arguing over stock prices, another deal was being cut involving the Royal Navy. Britain was desperate for destroyers. The German U-boats were sinking merchant ships, faster than British shipyards could replace them. The lifeline to North America was being severed. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers. These were World War I-era ships sitting in mothballs in American naval yards. They were obsolete, rusting, and of little value to the modern U.S. Navy. Roosevelt agreed to give them to Britain, but again, there was a price. He did not give them for free. He traded them. In exchange for 50 rusting ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a string of British naval and air bases across the Atlantic. From Newfoundland in Canada to the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Think about that trade scale. Britain gave the United States a strategic footprint that covered the entire Western Hemisphere. They handed over the keys to the Caribbean and the North Atlantic. They allowed the United States to build military bases on British sovereign territory, bases that would project American power for a century. All for 50 old ships that were barely seaworthy. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Britain was trading its long-term strategic assets for short-term tactical survival. It was the act of a desperate nation pawning the family silver to buy food. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed into law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone. The U.S. investments were being sold off. The bases were leased. The British treasury was empty. The Lend-Lease Act was hailed in public as the arsenal of democracy. It was presented as a noble act of solidarity, and in many ways it was. It provided the tanks, the planes, the oil, and the food that kept Britain alive. Without it, the Nazis would likely have starved the British Isles into submission. But the financial terms of the arrangement laid the groundwork for a post-war world, where Britain would be a debtor and America would be the creditor. The aid was not a gift. It was a lease. The underlying assumption was that there would be a reckoning. There would be a consideration. The text of the Lend-Lease Agreement contained a clause known as Article 7. It was a small paragraph written in dense diplomatic language, but it contained a poison pill for the British Empire. It stated that in return for the aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. Imperial preference was the economic wall that held the British Empire together. It was a system of tariffs that favored trade between Britain and its colonies: Canada, Australia, India, South Africa. It meant that British goods were cheaper in empire markets than American goods. It was the mechanism that allowed British industry to survive against more efficient American competition. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own economic defenses. They were agreeing to open up their empire to American exporters. They were signing the death warrant of their own trading bloc. The British negotiators fought against Article 7. They knew it meant the end of the empire as an economic unit, but they had no choice. The German bombers were overhead. The U-boats were in the Atlantic. The cash was gone. They signed. As 1941 turned into 1942, and the United States officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the dynamics shifted again. Now Britain and America were fighting side by side. American soldiers poured into Britain. The island became an immense aircraft carrier for the U.S. Army Air Force. But the financial disparity only grew. American industry, fueled by government spending, exploded in size and efficiency. The U.S. economy grew by enormous percentages every year. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was being distorted and cannibalized by the war effort. Britain stopped exporting. It converted every single factory to war production. It abandoned its markets in Latin America and Asia. And who stepped into those markets? American companies. While British factories were making Spitfires, American factories were making Spitfires and refrigerators and radios and cars for the global market. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously stealing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer of wealth was absolute. The gold reserves of the world had moved from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had shifted across the Atlantic. But the final humiliation was yet to come. The British believed that their sacrifice would be honored. They believed that, because they had fought alone against Hitler for 2 years, because they had bankrupted themselves to save the world, the Americans would treat them with generosity after the war. They believed that Lend-Lease would continue for a transition period. They believed there would be a soft landing. They were wrong. They had forgotten the lesson of the viscose sale. They had forgotten that in the world of high finance, gratitude is not a currency. The moment the war ended, the bill would come due. And the shock of that moment would break the back of what little remained of British power. The story of the price of victory is the story of how a nation can win a war militarily, but lose it economically. Britain had defeated Germany, but in doing so, it had defeated itself. It had spent its past to secure its present, and in the process, it had sold its future to its ally. On the 15th of August 1945, the news flashed around the world. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. In London, the crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, chanting, "We want the king." Bonfires were lit. Strangers hugged in the streets. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The tyranny of the Axis powers had been crushed. The British Empire had stood alone against the darkness, and it had prevailed. But across the Atlantic Ocean in Washington, D.C., there was no sentimentality. There was only a cold, bureaucratic machine that had been waiting for this exact moment to switch gears. 7 days after the victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a piece of paper that would devastate the British economy more effectively than any German bomb. He signed the order to terminate Lend-Lease. The cutoff was brutal and immediate. It was absolute. The order stated that as of that moment, all aid stopped. There was no transition period. There was no grace period. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, American Liberty ships loaded with wheat and meat and tools bound for Liverpool were ordered to turn around and sail back to the United States. The lifeline was severed. The British government was paralyzed by shock. They had assumed that the aid would continue to help them rebuild. They had assumed that their economy, which had been completely distorted to fight a common war, would be given time to adjust to peace. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist and advisor to the government, looked at the numbers and saw the abyss. Britain was importing half its food and almost all its raw materials. It was paying for them with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt. Not in a year, not in a month, but instantly. Keynes calculated that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. The country would have to default on its payments. It would have to stop importing food. The rations, which had been meager during the war, would have to be cut to starvation levels. The industries would have no raw materials to work with. There would be mass unemployment and social collapse. There was only one option. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington. He was sick, exhausted, and suffering from a heart condition that would soon kill him. He was the greatest economic mind of the century, but he was going to America not as an intellectual, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case. He planned to walk into the U.S. Treasury and argue that Britain had fought the war for 2 years alone, while America remained neutral. He would argue that Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to save Western civilization. Therefore, the United States should give Britain a gift, a grant, $6 billion, not a loan, but a retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had spent holding the line. He called it justice. But when he arrived in Washington, he found that justice was not a currency the Americans recognized. The mood had changed. The war was over. The American public was tired of paying for Europe. The politicians in Congress were suspicious of the new Labour government in Britain, which had just been elected on a platform of socialism and nationalizing industries. They didn't want to use American capitalist tax dollars to fund a British socialist experiment. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were hard-faced men. They looked at Keynes with cold eyes. They told him bluntly there would be no gift. There would be no grant. There would only be a loan, and it would be a loan on commercial terms with interest. Keynes was devastated. He argued. He pleaded. He warned them that if they crushed Britain financially, they would destroy a vital ally against the rising threat of the Soviet Union. But the Americans held all the cards. They knew Britain had no other place to go. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion. It was barely enough to survive, and it came with strings attached. Strings that were designed to strangle the last remnants of the British Empire's economic independence. The most poisonous condition was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. This meant that anyone in the world who held British pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for US dollars. The Americans framed this as free trade. They said they wanted to open up the global markets, but in reality, it was a way to break the sterling area. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payments in pounds, but had forbidden them from exchanging those pounds for dollars. This forced countries like India, Australia, and Egypt to buy British goods because their money was only good in Britain. It was a closed loop that protected British industry. The Americans wanted to smash that loop. They knew that if the pound became convertible, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell them to buy dollars, because everyone wanted American goods, not British ones. American cars were better. American fridges were better. American machines were better. Keynes knew this condition was a death trap. He knew that the moment convertibility was introduced, there would be a run on the pound that would drain the loan in weeks. He fought against it until his health broke. But the alternative was starvation. Reluctantly, bitterly, the British Parliament voted to accept the loan. They described it as a financial Munich. They were appeasing the Americans to survive. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died just a few months later, his heart finally giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. But the tragedy was just beginning. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Blizzards buried the country in snow. Coal stockpiles froze. Power stations shut down. Factories closed. People shivered in unheated homes, lighting candles because there was no electricity. It was in this frozen, dark atmosphere that the reality of the victory came home to the British people. They had won the war, but their standard of living was plummeting. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the darkest days of the U-boat blockade, was rationed in peacetime. The age of austerity had begun, and then the clock struck on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, per the terms of the loan, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes had predicted. It was a financial massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries that had been stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it to get their hands on precious US dollars. The money from the American loan, which was supposed to last for years, began to evaporate. In just 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The hemorrhage was so violent that the government watched in horror as their reserves vanished. They were bleeding to death. After just 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility. They slammed the window shut. They had to go to the U.S. Treasury and admit total failure. They had burned through a huge portion of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was total. The British Empire had tried to play by American rules and had been crushed. This financial weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences. This was the moment the baton of world power was officially dropped by London and picked up by Washington. In February 1947, the British government sent a secret telegram to the U.S. State Department. It was a message of resignation. For a century, Britain had been the guardian of Greece and Turkey, keeping the Russians out of the Mediterranean. But now, with the treasury empty, Britain could no longer afford to pay the soldiers or subsidize the Greek government. The telegram essentially said, "We are broke. We are leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in to fill the vacuum. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. It was a regional power trying to keep the lights on. The economic misery dragged on. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant and the reserves low, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, the pound had been worth 4.86. In 1949, it was slashed to 2.80 overnight. The British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports became more expensive. The cost of living rose. It was a recognition that the British economy was no longer competitive. But the final bill for the war wasn't just paid in the 1940s. It was a mortgage that spanned generations. The Anglo-American Loan of 1946, the money borrowed to keep Britain from starving after the victory, was not a gift. It was a commercial debt with interest. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the boom of the 50s, the gloom of the 70s, the Thatcher years, and the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. Think about that, 60 years after the guns fell silent, 60 years after the victory parades, the British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. The story of the price of victory is the ultimate debunking of the idea that wars have winners. In the modern era, total war is a negative-sum game. Germany lost the war and was destroyed. But Britain won the war and was bankrupted. The only true winner was the United States. The U.S. economy doubled in size during the war. Its industry was untouched by bombs. It held 2/3 of the world's gold. And through the mechanisms of Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, it successfully dismantled the trading preferences of the British Empire. opening up global markets for American goods. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought it. It acquired the assets, the bases, and the geopolitical influence in a distressed asset sale managed by the U.S. Treasury. For the British people, the legacy of 1941 remained a scar on the national psyche. It created a lingering sense of decline, a feeling that the best days were in the past. It fueled the special relationship, which was always a polite euphemism for dependency. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his country from Hitler, but he also signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no other choice, but the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the war as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe. It was a noble sacrifice, perhaps the noblest in history. But in the cold, hard light of economics, it was a liquidation. The empire didn't fall. It was sold off piece by piece to pay the bill for doing the right thing.